Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, honoring Arbor Day on April 26th, with an ongoing commitment to sustainable stewardship and conservation of Missouri's forests. ChooseWood.com.
Most of my work, honestly, is listening and really helping people just feel what they're feeling and trying to process. Two words that really have come up, for me at least, in this pandemic, and I've seen on the floor, is issues of isolation and helplessness. And those are felt in so many different fronts of this pandemic, and whether it's patients or families or even the staff having those same feelings.
You may have dealt with more than your share of sadness and loss this year. It's been a difficult year for so many people. But for the Reverend Allison Wible, these things aren't just a fact of 2020. They're also her job. The Reverend Wible is a hospital chaplain for Mercy Hospital St. Louis, and she joins us today to discuss that work. Reverend Wible, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So let's start with sort of the very basic thing. What do you see as the role of a chaplain?
So as a hospital chaplain, I provide spiritual and emotional support for our patients and families, and that looks different for different families because I view spirituality in a pretty broad way of simply it's how we cope with being human. It's how we make sense of being human. And so for some, that has very specific religious needs, but for others, and when you're in a hospital, it's about trying to make sense of what's going on in their world right then.
So you are at a Catholic hospital. Do you approach things at all from that perspective?
I start with the patient and where they are with their spirituality and what those needs are, and we go from there.
Okay. So they really help shape which direction it goes.
Absolutely. It's very patient-driven. And so while the hospital is a Catholic hospital and we adhere to those ethics and spirituality, when it comes to patient care, it's patient-centered, and we start with that, where they're at.
And so they might share a bit about their religious background, or do they generally just jump right in and start talking to you about what they're dealing with?
Oh, gosh, it depends on the person. And that's one of the joys, is that I never know what I get when I walk into a room. And so, but being in a hospital is such a vulnerable place for people that often they're really just trying to make sense of what's going on with them, whether it's because of a new diagnosis or a long-term illness or family members who are struggling with grief. I mean, it's a wide gamut of the kind of issues we ended up dealing with. And so it really depends on the space they're in when we walk into the room at that moment.
When you walk into the room, are they summoning you to come into the room, or do you pop by to see if anybody could use some help?
Both. So it depends. They're kind of my own red flags I hear when I hear about what's going on with patients, that sometimes I think I should check in on them. Other times patients themselves will bring up an issue that they want to discuss or have a need that they're able to articulate. So it really depends. I have the fortune to be unit-based, so I work in specifically 2 units in the hospital, and so I get to know our staff as well, and they often will raise concerns with me or kind of give me a heads up that someone's struggling that day.
Okay. So they might know that somebody is in need of this, even if they don't quite realize it yet.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when people hear the word chaplain, there's often a lot of misconceptions, but also just assumptions made. And so, but really I do most of my work, honestly, is listening and really helping people just feel what they're feeling and trying to process what they're dealing with in those moments.
So what so many people have been dealing with this year relates to COVID-19. When did you first start getting access to people who were dealing with that in these units that you serve?
Well, one of the units I serve is our step-down unit, our transitional care unit, and honestly, COVID came to that unit. And so from the very beginning in March, when we started having our first COVID admissions, myself and my coworkers up there were beginning to care for those patients and specifically their families as well, because my role isn't just patient care, it's family care, and especially with COVID, with the limited access that people have to their family members, that's become a really important piece of the work I do. So
They need to talk to you about the fact that they can't get to talk to their loved one?
Absolutely, or they're processing the information they're hearing from the medical team and trying to understand, or we've tried to help facilitate communication by video visits, or sometimes families will send me a picture to print out and to place on someone's wall, or just to process all of it, because it's, the two words that really have come up for me, at least in this pandemic, and I've seen on the floor, is issues of isolation and helplessness. And those are felt in so many different fronts of this pandemic, and whether it's patients or families or even the staff having those same feelings.
So this idea of isolation, that was designed to help keep this disease from spreading. Were you frightened going into these rooms where family members weren't allowed to be there with people who were suffering? Yeah,
at the beginning, we didn't go into rooms at the beginning because no one knew, right? Mm-hmm. It was all so new. And so as things have gone on, I had the freedom to use my professional judgment as to who had higher needs and who needed a visit inside a room versus a phone call versus standing outside the room versus strictly family care on the phone. And so I've been able to make those evaluations myself. And so, of course, the nervousness is there, but I've also trusted the process and the PPE, and there's just the needs are so high. It's hard to stay away.
You are now going into those rooms, people who are suffering from COVID-19.
Yes, and at end of life and compassion care and those kinds of things. Absolutely.
And so I know, as you say, each case is so different, but for people who are suffering from this disease, what kind of conversations have you been able to have with them?
It depends. There's conversations around, I've had several conversations with people who are anticipating being intubated, and that's a scary conversation to have, to see that kind of looming on the horizon for someone. I have conversations with family members about how to make decisions about whether their loved one's going to make it or not. How would they even go about grieving, or how would they go about even having an end-of-life ritual in a situation where they're trying to decide even whether or not they should be at the bedside, because we have allowed family members in at end-of-life situations. And so we talk even then about how we still can have I borrow the phrase, a good death from the hospice work I trained in, but how we even do that in an end-of-life situation in a hospital setting and with a scenario like COVID.
So this work sounds so important, but it also sounds so heavy. Have you been able to bear the burden this year without yourself falling down?
I appreciate time off. I appreciate really embracing my family when I do have that time off, and the gift they give me of letting me nap when I need to. But yeah, it's definitely been a challenge, and I've leaned on my coworkers. The staff that are on those floors have been amazing, and we often support each other. And a lot of the work I started doing too when we pivoted with COVID was around staff care as well. And I've come to realize I receive a lot from them as well as give.
How are staff members doing in the midst of all this? We're seeing some pretty heavy case volumes lately. I guess first of all I should ask, how have things been on the floors you work in recent weeks?
It's been stressful. It's been more intense. I think we were all feeling the burden a little bit more, and it ebbs and flows, and the intensity ebbs and flows as we go. And I think there's an accumulation of grief, and so when that intensity starts to rise, we start to feel that accumulation more. And there's no need to find some kind of release for that.
And are staff members finding that? The healthcare professionals that you deal with, how are they holding up in the midst of all this?
I think they're tired. I think they're ready to see an end. We had a little bit of light last week when Mercy started giving out dose 1 of the vaccine, and you could feel a lightness a little bit of saying maybe there's something can change, because it does start to feel like that we can't keep going the way we are. It feels, because that burden, that accumulation just becomes really thick and really, really intense after a while, and everybody up there needs a break of some kind at some point.
Is there a day that stands out to you as this was just the hardest day in this whole many-month slog?
Yeah, there's a few of them. Sometimes they're the days that was the first time something happened. So, for example, I still remember the first moment I prayed a prayer of commendation for the dying for a patient that I was not at bedside for, but did through the window and with a family member. And I remember, and then I remember one of the first times where it's just the intensity. So, it's the unexpected. And that's the thing about COVID it's so unexpected. We'll have patients who you think are about to walk out the door and then suddenly, don't. They code. Something else happens. And when you thought they were getting better, the trajectory changes really quickly. And so some days that are memorable for not being great ones are because of just multiple deaths or multiple intensity, multiple things happening that are intense those days.
That sounds so hard. I mean, it just, how do you even keep going under that burden? It feels almost impossible.
But there's also, I don't know, it's like anything hard in life. There's also the part where you see people come together and you see family members even able to find meaning and find ways of saying goodbye that is part of that kind of life cycle. And none of these are ideal circumstances, but to watch resiliency, to watch people pivot and be creative, to watch my staff who are amazing people and who just rose to the occasion. None of us chose COVID, right? No one chooses this, and yet they've really risen to the challenge, and they're caring and people who want what's best. And I admire getting to work with them. They inspire me to keep going.
We're talking today to the Reverend Allison Wible. She's a hospital chaplain for Mercy Hospital, St. Louis, dealing with a very difficult 2020 and still finding some moments of grace and it sounds like even things that can make you feel good in the midst of all of this. I feel like for so many of us, we just feel tongue-tied by other people's grief. What would be your advice for people who are seeing friends or family suffering or dealing with death and just don't know what to say?
I would say don't feel like you have to say anything. I think sometimes we open our mouths when really just being there and letting them know that you see them is the most important thing. I think sometimes it's not words. It's going to be something else, which is hard in a time where you can't just go sit with somebody, right? We don't always get that luxury right now of being in the same physical space, but finding ways to let people know you're there, but words get in the way of that compassion sometimes, I think.
Yeah, that seems like that's got to be so much harder to do over, say, Zoom. I mean, is there a way you can sort of be there for somebody without being able to be there for them?
Oh, what a great question. I'm trying to think off the top of my head right now. I had this image of just sending someone a picture of a candle you light for them. Or and maybe this is where we do go to images instead of words in a time where the words are just... It's overwhelming, and there is nothing that can be said that fixes. This isn't about fixing things, but definitely about somehow just showing that connection. It's about connection right now.
What's a common thing you say to families and patients that all of us might benefit from hearing now?
Oh, gosh. Again, I try not to use words when I can.
Sorry, we're in the wrong medium for images. I shouldn't have asked that.
No, words are good too. Honestly, I find myself acknowledging that, yes, it's all suffering. And sometimes people say, oh my gosh, you must see all of this when we're in it. And I say, yes, but this is your mom. This is your dad. This is your spouse. And so we're all feeling this. But when it's yours, it's a whole different thing. And we all have to sit in this grief. We have to sit in the loss of it. And these are not ideal circumstances. And so we don't live in the ideal right now.
So for people who are depressing. It really is depressing.
It is, but it's also true. And I think when it's true and when we say that, then we can also, then it lets us also let in the joy or the memories or the ways of connecting that are there that outweigh that depressing time, that outweigh any of that.
Yeah, I mean, for people who've lost someone they really love in this past year, we're headed into this holiday season. What would be your advice for them acknowledging that grief or remembering it in the middle of holiday festivities?
That's a hard thing, isn't it? And in a time when not only is it that there might be someone missing from that dinner table, but everything's different. Everything feels different in the way. And so letting it be different might be my advice. Just letting it be different, letting some of those traditions and those things fall away if they're naturally falling away. But at the same time, if there's something that you need to hold on to lean into that really feels like that place of connection, then that's what we hold on to right now.
You mentioned one other spot of good news, and that is that people started to get vaccinated at your hospital last week.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, where do you stand in line? Are you going to see a vaccine soon?
I actually saw one last week. Go into my arm, yes.
So that's got to feel good.
I was surprised at the emotional reaction I had to it, honestly, because it does. It's been 9-10 months now, and I forgot the kind of tension I carry, and part of that is affiliated with what if I get sick? What if I take it home to my family? And that's taking it home to my family, of course, is the worst case scenario in my mind. And so to realize that some of that was easing up, that there might be a little more breathing room, that was a relief, and it felt, I was surprised by that feeling.
Did you almost have a physical reaction to feeling, hey, this burden has been taken off me?
Yeah, I think I did. I felt a release in my chest. I felt like I could rest a little bit in a different way. And I find even when I was walking the halls this morning, I found myself going, wow, that resistance I have, or that kind of checkpoint I have in my head of like, is this something I need to go into the room for? Is this not? I find myself thinking, I'm not going to have to worry about that in quite the same way. And that layer that's been added to my assessments and to my workload, I could feel that starting to bend a little bit, and that was nice.
So you felt that starting to bend, and we know that in some months' time, so many more people are going to be in that same boat. Do you see at this point the light at the end of this tunnel?
I don't know. It's hard to go that far, I think. It's hard to think that far ahead because we're not quite there, but I have hope. I have hope that next Christmas we'll be doing this a little bit differently than we are this Christmas, this holiday season. So I'm hopeful. Yes, I would say overall I'm hopeful.
Well, the Reverend Allison Wible, chaplain from Mercy Hospital, St. Louis, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, honoring Arbor Day on April 26th, with an ongoing commitment to sustainable stewardship and conservation of Missouri's forests. ChooseWood.com.